This is part 3 of Unit 13. Again, we're talking about World War II, specifically the war in Europe. Up to this point, the United States has remained relatively neutral. We'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. We're going to go back and talk about the home front and what's going on in America during the war. But when the war breaks out, so in other words, when Hitler invades Poland, the United States remains isolated again. They want to stay out of it. That's one of their big goals. It's a European thing, not an American thing. As things get worse, as I mentioned, FDR wants to do more to help because he kind of sees the handwriting on the wall that Hitler's not going to be content with just a few land grabs. He's going to want more and more and more, and he realizes we're going to get sucked into this. And so he does some things to help Britain out, most notably something called the Lend-Lease. But we'll talk more about that, like I said, a little bit later. But the event, of course, that gets the United States into the war is Pearl Harbor. And we'll talk more about this again when we get to the war in the Pacific. I'll mention it a little bit. But Pearl Harbor is the event that gets us into war. That's December 7th, 1941. A little background information on this. Japan, of course, is one of the allies of Germany. And it is also similar in the fact that it's trying to gain territory. They're going to solve their economic problems through conquest. And in particularly, we're talking about the invasion of its neighbor China. Japan is similar to other island nations that it has to import a lot of goods. It doesn't have land, so it doesn't have a lot of natural resources on its own. Most of its islands are volcanic islands, so there's not a lot of plentiful natural resources. So they have to import stuff, and over time they get tired of that. And they basically say, China's right next door, they got tons of resources, we could just take what we want from them. So instead of buying them, we could, just take it from them. They're weak and we're stronger than them. Well, the United States resists this and basically, tells Japan that we're not going to allow you to do that. Well, Japan does it anyway, and so the American and Japan, start to have disagreements and fights over that issue because Japan wants to expand, get bigger, become a major world power. The United States is standing in their way, and so what Japan ultimately does is attack us. The United States has made it clear that if Japan continues to fight in China and other places, we're going to intervene, and so we're going to stand in their way. Japan analyzes that situation and says, the United States is bigger than us. They have more factories, they have more people. If we go toe to them in a fair fight, we're going to lose. But that doesn't mean we're going to change our plans. We're not going to back down from wanting to conquer. So what we will do is we will sucker punch the United States. We will attack them when they're not expecting it, deal them a horrible blow, and while they are licking their wounds and getting back in fighting shape, we will conquer and expand and become so big and powerful that the United States won't want to attack us after that because we're much bigger and stronger. That's their rationale for attacking Pearl Harbor and striking first. They want to get us weak, and then as we rebuild, they're going to get stronger, and then it'll be more of a fair fight later on. That's their plan or strategy. And so they attacked Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th, and prior to 9/11, this was the worst attack in U.S. history, of course. Over 2,000 people killed, and many of our battleships in our Pacific Fleet were destroyed or crippled. However, one of the big targets of Pearl Harbor was the aircraft carriers, and they were not there at the time. They were out practicing maneuvers out in the ocean, and so they were left unhurt, which allows us to get in the fight quicker than Japan anticipated. But we'll get to that when we get more in the war in the Pacific. So for now, it's sufficient to say that the United States is attacked. The next day, FDR asked for a declaration of war, and he gets it. And so the United States is going to go to war. Now, the United States sees the Axis powers as a threat, but Hitler as the biggest threat. And so we're going to focus our attention on taking out Hitler first. Basically, Hitler's stronger. Also, if we can help Britain, then that's a powerful ally that can help us defeat Japan. So it's just seen as, Hitler's seen as the biggest threat. We have to take him out first. So make sure you understand that. Some historians would say, well, it's really not as nice and clean is that some historians would say, well, the Japanese are killing Asian people. We don't care about Asian people as much as white people. Hitler's killing white people. That's why we have to help them first. Depends on what you want to believe, I guess. But nevertheless, Hitler is in the war in Europe is made top priority. Now, the leader of all Allied forces in the war in Europe is going to be Eisenhower. So he's the leader of the U.S. and the British forces, basically all the Allied forces in Europe. Make sure you know that. The first place we're going to fight is not in Europe, however, it's going to be in Africa. The German people don't, or the German army doesn't just fight in Europe. Once they pretty much conquer most of Europe after France falls, they start to spread their tentacles more and more places. They even get to North Africa. One of the big things they want here is the Suez Canal in Egypt, which connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Indian Ocean, so that they don't have to sail around Africa. That's a big goal of theirs in this battle. But they start to conquer more and more territory. This is where American soldiers fight first, and you can see that on the boards here. When America first fights against the British or the German, we don't do very well. We're unorganized, we are inexperienced. Where the Germans have been fighting for a couple years, they're accustomed, they're veterans, they do very well. And so America loses a lot of the first battles. Okay? Some famous people that are connected with the Africa campaign, we have the British General Montgomery. I just mentioned him in briefly passing because you might come across him in other readings. The more famous guy, the guy more important to know, is the German general known as Erwin Rommel. He's also called the Desert Fox because he usually wins in these battles even though he's outnumbered and things like that. He's going to pop up time and time again in our story. You're going to see him in charge of the forces at D-Day. He's also rumored to have been someone that tried to get rid of Hitler. So he's a pretty important German general to know. The other U.S. general that I'd like you to know is a guy named Patton. We'll talk a little bit more about him in class. I'll show you a clip about him. But he is the U.S. tank commander, and he's pretty important in the war in Europe. He comes in and saves us a couple of times, and he's one that's going to come into Africa and get us from losers to winners. He's going to come in and shape us all up and things like that. Like I said, we'll talk more about Patton, or his nickname was Old Blood and Guts, a little bit more in class. Back to Europe and the war there. As you know, Hitler had a secret agreement with Russia at the start of the war. And now we get to 1941, so that's 2 years after the war in Poland. And Hitler is going to stab his ally or his friend Stalin in the back, and he's going to invade Russia, as you can see here. Now, if you read Mein Kampf, you know that what Hitler said he needed was Lebensraum, which is breathing space or room for his great mass of people, his great empire. Well, from the very get-go, his target had been Russia. That's the breathing room that he wants. He wants that great farmland that's in the western part of Russia, like what we call Ukraine today. He wants that. That's the breathing space he wants. Okay? That's his target from the get-go. The reason he doesn't attack them first is because he wants to avoid what we talked about earlier, that two-front war, fighting on the east and on the west. Well, pretty much he's eliminated pretty much everybody in Europe except Britain, and he tries to bomb the heck out of them to get them to surrender. He comes close, but doesn't quite succeed. But he figures they're so weak, they're not much of a threat. So then he invades Russia because he thinks he can throw all of his army at them, and he doesn't have to worry about his rear. Okay? And very early on, Germany does very well in Russia. They go in like a hot knife through butter, and they push the Russians back. Of course, Russians are caught off guard. They're not expecting this because they're allied and so forth. And as they go through and conquer more and more Russian land, Hitler sends in what is called the Einsatzgruppen, or what's called the death squads. Basically, what the job of these death squads are, and there's 3 of them, is they go into conquered territory, and it's their job to get rid of the undesirables. Okay? Ask yourself what would be an undesirable if you conquered somebody. Certainly it would be people that are smart, people that are leaders, people that are going to resist. But of course, we also should know, in this case, it's Jews. He wants to clean out this area of anything that's going to cause trouble, including the whole root of the problem in Europe, the Jews. So he's getting this land ready for them. So these death squads go from town to town to town, lining up these undesirables. They shoot them in these mass graves and bury them and move on to the next town. So it's like they come here to South Hart and they go and they kill 500-600 people, and then they come to Dickinson and they kill 3,000 or 4,000, and then they go to Richardson and Taylor, and they just keep going. They just keep going from town to town or village and village, rounding these people up and killing them and executing them in mass graves. Horrible, horrible stuff. These are the death squads that come in. And the reason that I mention this now, because this is more of Holocaust material, but the reason that I mention it now is because I want you to know that the fighting in Russia, the fighting between Russia and Germany, is some of the worst of the war, and that's going to become important later on to our story. In fact, Russia loses more people during World War II than any other country. I think it's over 11 million people. 11 million Russians die, and when Russia starts to win, it's going to be payback time. And so they both do some really nasty stuff for each other. Now, Russia actually is going to win this battle eventually, and this is the strategy that they use to win. It's called trading space for time. Now, you probably know that the Soviet Union, as it was called at the time, is the largest country in the world. So they have lots and lots of territory and land. So what their strategy is we are going to fight the Germans, slow them down, and then retreat. Fight, retreat, fight, retreat. We're trying to slow them down for the Russian winter to come in. If you know your history, the Russian winter has saved them from conquest many times, most famously probably Napoleon. You probably remember that from modern nations. And so that's their strategy. We're just trying to slow them down enough for the Russian winter to come in, because the Russian winters are very harsh. And in this case, it works. Not only do they slow them down, but the Russian winter starts a little early. And what ends up happening is they get snow or rains, which turn to snow in early October, and Russia's a little backwards. They don't have a lot of paved roads, so the roads turn into mud, and the Germans can't get their supplies as fast as their soldiers are going. And so then when the actual winter sets in, the German soldiers are in summer uniforms. They don't have enough equipment, enough food, enough bullets, these kinds of things, and that's when the Russians are going to strike back then. So that's their strategy, and it works very well. And so this takes us to the turning point in the war in Europe, which is the Battle of Stalingrad. This is the turning point against the Nazis. This is when the Russians dig in and they refuse to move, and they're going to fight back and try to push Germany back. And in fact, they do that. Now, Hitler gets very close to his goal and almost gets to the capital city of Moscow, which would have given him, the opportunity to probably get Russia to surrender, perhaps. But he doesn't, because at this Battle of Stalingrad, this is the turning point. The Russians then have bought enough time to get ready. They're ready to push back, and they do, and they defeat the German army. They capture a bunch of them, and they start pushing them back, and Germany has to retreat. So this is a very famous battle in this war in Europe, because it's when Germany starts to lose and they have to retreat. So it's the beginning of the end. This takes us to probably one of the most famous events throughout the whole war, D-Day, or its code name was Operation Overlord, or sometimes it's referred to as the invasion of Normandy. This is when we tried to reclaim Europe from the Nazis. So we're going to invade France. Normandy is a region of France, and you can see here this is in June of 1944, so this is quite a bit after the Russians have started to push them back. So that tells you that fighting is pretty harsh and brutal. Like I said, that's some of the worst fighting throughout the whole war. Both sides doing really horrible things to each other. That goes on for quite a while. Okay, but we get to D-Day, and we'll see this more clearly in class. I have some videos that we'll see. In June of 1944, this is the biggest battle that's ever happened on our planet. Very, very massive in skies, thousands of ships and planes and hundreds of thousands of troops, of course. And it is basically the idea that we have to conquer in Europe and reclaim it and push the Nazis back to Germany And this is where we get that two-front war kind of thing here, where we're going to force Germany to split their forces so we can crush them from both sides, the Russians on one and the rest of the Allies on the other. And we are successful at this. We do get a foothold on European soil, and we do start to push them back. And again, we'll talk more about that in class. Once that happens, once D-Day happens and we're successful, we get the Yalta Conference. This is a meeting of the three main Allied powers. So we have Churchill from England, we have FDR from the United States, and we have Stalin from the Soviet Union. We're coming together because basically when D-Day is successful, we have Russia and us crushing Germany from both sides. We know that the war is going to end in our favor. We just don't know how long. The war is basically won. So what they decide to do is they want to meet to figure out what are we going to do once the war is over. And they want to avoid the problems and the mistakes that they made after World War I, where they treated the losers very harshly. And of course, the Treaty of Versailles ending that war, we know, is kind of a cause of World War II. So they talked about lots of things. I'm going to make you focus on three of them. One is we're only going to accept an unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. That's our goal. No, Germany can't say we'll surrender if or but or when. No, it's just we give up, do what you will. We're only going to accept the unconditional surrender. Two, we're going to let the people of these nations that Nazi Germany has conquered and the Axis powers conquer have their own free democratic elections, figure out what kind of government they want, who they want in power. We're not going to take control of these lands. We're not going to run these other countries. They're going to run themselves in the ways that they see fit. And then three, we're going to set up a United Nations, or a League of Nations 2.0, if you will. We're going to set up another worldwide organization to settle problems between countries again peacefully, deal with these things in a more civilized way rather than resorting to war. So again, they talked about other things, but these are the three main ones I want you to agree on. Again, this is when they realize the war is won, they sit down and figure out, okay, what do we want to happen here afterwards? So quickly then, to finish the war in Europe, the last real battle of the war after D-Day is something called the Battle of the Bulge, which happens in, as you can see here, in December of 1944. This is when Hitler throws everything he has left at us. And basically what his goal is here is he's trying to split our front into two and force the war to go on long enough, because he's hoping for a miracle. The miracle being he's working on some secret weapons like an atomic bomb and some other things. He's got some rockets right now, they're called V2 rockets, that he's using to bomb Britain at this time, and he's hoping he can have a nuclear weapon to do that, and that will turn it around and cause him to win the war. He does not do it. He gets very close at the Battle of the Bulge into making this happen, but the United States and the Allies actually hold and keep him from prolonging the war, basically because his tanks and stuff run out of gas, and the war comes to an end shortly after this. And that is called VE Day, or Victory in Europe, which is May 7th, 1945. And that's just the victory of the war in Europe. You know that Hitler commits suicide a couple days before this, as the Russians break into Berlin first. But basically after the Battle of the Bulge, it's just a race to see who can get to Berlin the fastest, because now all he has is 60-year-old guys and 16-year-old guys, really old and young soldiers. There's not much left. There's not much industry going. I'll show you a clip in class what we're doing to a lot of their cities now. It's payback time. So Germany's really suffering, and basically when Hitler commits suicide, the German generals then sue for peace. And that takes us to VE Day. Now this is kind of a quick overview. Again, we didn't have time to go through all the parts of Europe, but I am going to talk about some of them more in class a little bit and give you a chance to ask some questions about some specific ones. But that's going to end part 3. In part 4, we'll talk about the war in Pacific then. Remember, I split them up, so a lot of these events are happening at the same time, but that's the end of part 3.